welcome to the Rediscovery channel. This is a channel where every week I, Ivor Kovac, and my good friend Stilgar take turns coming up with topics from history that the other person doesn't know about and probably hasn't heard about. However, today we're going to do some bonus content because the channel has really been growing, both on YouTube and on BitChute. So I wanted to give you guys some extra content and depending on how this is received, we may do more bonus videos in the future. So do give us some feedback. So for today, what I want to talk about is actually not something from history, but something from fantasy. So I want to talk about JRR Tolkien's Elves. Tolkien is my favorite author, and I'm a pretty big Tolkien fan. Stilgar is lesser Tolkien fan, but I think you've read all of the Lord of the Rings books, right?
Yeah, and I just finished the book about, was it, oh my gosh, Hurin's sons, I guess.
The Children of Hurin?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so one of the reasons that I decided to do this topic and bring it to this channel that normally deals with history is because we also deal with mythology. And when Tolkien first set out to build the Middle-earth and started working on his lore, he was actually trying to create a new set of mythology, which was geographically and culturally specific to England. So I think in light of that, it's fair to spend some time on this topic. And after I read, I don't know about you, but after I read Lord of the Rings, I wanted to understand some of the stuff, like what does it mean when it talks about elves fading? And, for example, and why is it that they want to go back to Valinor? That sort of thing. So I do have some answers. To begin with, the elves, they wake up actually in the far east of Middle-earth in a place called Cuiviénen, which means waters of awakening. And this is not a place that appears in any of the maps in the front of the Lord of the Rings or Silmarillion. Like the eastern part is not included on the map. But there are some maps which I'll include in the slideshow. So when the elves awake, they refer to themselves as Quindi, which means those that speak with voices. Because in the early days, they were only aware of animals, and they noticed that they were the only beings that could talk. So then, early on in the history, the elves divide up into different groups. So they are invited to come to Valinor, which is where the Valar live. And the Valar are kind of like angels, but not quite. Like, I guess I would say they're somewhere between, concept-wise, somewhere between an angel and a pagan god, because they are male and female. They start out in heaven, but then they come down to the earth, and they're responsible for governing the different elements and such, and they kind of live apart from it. And they invite the first elves to come and live with them. And a lot of them go, but then a lot of them refuse to go. So all of the elves...
This is actually in Children of Hurin.
Children of Odin?
The Children of, was it Hurin, right? I just read the book.
Children of Hurin.
Yeah.
Yeah, humans come later. Like the elves are made first. And
but they describe that the elves are described there. The ones that follow the invitation, they are named differently than the ones that refuse the invitation, and even the ones that set out to go but then just like stop in the middle of their trip back to the Valar, they are still, I guess, designated as, I forgot the name, but I'm sure you have it.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Right. So all of the elves who accept the invitation, both them and their descendants for the rest of time, are referred to as Eldar. And then those who refuse, as well as their descendants, are referred to as Avari, which means the refusers. So in most of the books that were completed in the complete stories like Lord of the Rings, Children of Húrin, Silmarillion, Fall of Gondolin, all that stuff, most of the elves that you're seeing in those stories are actually Eldar. Some of the Eldar, they go all the way to Valinor, and those are the strongest, the most intelligent, the most attractive, the most powerful, so on and so forth. And then after them is those who started the journey but remained in Middle Earth. And they, even though they didn't go all the way, they're still counted as Eldar. And then the least advanced are the Avari. And the Avari don't actually come much into the stories, but they do a little bit, like they're actually in the Hobbit. So most of the elves in Mirkwood, they actually are Avari, but they have a ruling class that's Eldar, that's Sindar. So the term Avari, it means the refusers. And there is a breakdown of the different tribes of elves. So those who you mentioned, like that broke off on the way, there's 3 tribes. There's the Sindar, Nandor, and Laquindi. And even though these guys didn't make it to Valinor, they're still considered Eldar. And then those that did go all the way to Valinor, you have the Vanyar, Noldar, and Teleri. And all these guys together are considered Eldar. So the invitation to come to Valinor is always open to all the Eldar, even those who never finished the journey, and even those who decided to go back to Middle Earth after having gone to Valinor. So, and there's actually a letter, one of the Tolkien letters, which if you're a Tolkien fan, you really should read all these letters. They're all in a book called Letters of JRR Tolkien. But what he says in letter 154 is, but the promise made to the Eldar, the high elves, not to other varieties, they had long before made their irrevocable choice, preferring Middle Earth to paradise, for their sufferings and the struggle with the prime Dark Lord had still to be fulfilled, that they should always be able to leave Middle Earth if they wished, and pass over the sea to the true west by the straight road, and so come to Eurasia. So one thing that the movies got wrong is they talk about like, oh, all the elves are going to leave Middle Earth. But actually, only the Eldar even have the ability to leave. The Avari are stuck. Their choice is irrevocable. They can't change their mind and decide to go later on. So that's...
And so the Wood Elves are Avari or they're Eldar?
So yeah, most of the Wood Elves who are living in Mirkwood and in Lothlorien are actually Avari, but in Lothlorien they have a ruling class of, so like Galadriel, she's a Noldar. She came all the way back from Valinor, and she's
What about
very powerful.
Legolas?
Okay, so Legolas's father is a Sindar. The Sindar are the Grey Elves. They are considered to be Eldar. They stopped off the journey in Beleriand, which no longer exists by the time you get to Lord of the Rings. So Thranduil's father, who I forget the name of, he actually came and settled in Mirkwood and took over the Avari that were there. So they had a small group of ruling elites that were Sindar, and they actually kind of downgraded technologically and culturally to live among the Avari. So the reason that Legolas can go to Valinor is because he's actually a Sindar, even though most of his people are Avari. So when he left, I would guess that the people that helped him build his ship and sail it were probably part of the original Sindar ruling class that came and took over, because most of the Avari, they're not allowed to go.
Okay.
So yeah, good question. But yeah, that's the reason why, is because they're technically...
Is it, and the name, maybe, sorry, I'm trying to follow, but the name of the elves that have gone back and followed the calling, but they went back to Middle Earth, what are they called again?
Noldar.
Did you mention?
Yeah, the Noldar, like Galadriel is one of those.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
the
because they want to defeat Morgoth, right? That's why they return. Or
that was
am I?
part of the reason why they
Yeah.
returned. They also there was this rumor started by Morgoth among them that the Valar were actually trying to keep them from inheriting the earth, and in order to make it easier for the humans to take over. So Fëanor, he kind of stirred them all up, and they followed him. He wanted to get the Silmarils back from Morgoth, but a lot of them, they also just wanted space and kingdoms of their own. So they go back to Middle Earth, but pretty much everything that they made gets destroyed, and eventually all the Noldor do go back to Valinor, or at least that's how it looks. So
Yeah, and just you mentioned before that Babylon 5 was inspired by Lord of the Rings. Is that why they have the Minbari have Valen, right? Is that inspired by that, or is it just because it's similar to Valar?
I think Valen is okay. So Valen is the human, the first captain. What was his name?
Yeah,
Sinclair.
yeah. He
Yeah,
goes back in time, right? But
yeah,
they
and
all, to them, it's like a saint, or it's almost like a demigod, right?
yeah,
The
he
same.
becomes a great cultural hero to them because he brings the space station, and then
Yeah.
and then like the reason that the ambassador Delin, she becomes part human, so she becomes it's to kind of repay the humans because they took a human, so now they're offering one of their people back to the humans, basically.
Yeah.
And
Anyway, but I don't want to throw you off too much. But yeah, okay.
actually,
I was just wondering about that when I was reading about the Phalar. Yeah.
well, I mean that's like okay. So if you recall, at the end of Babylon 5, all of the elder species, they leave the galaxy, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of like what happens with all the high elves, the Noldar. They all
Yeah.
leave Middle
Good
Earth.
point. Yeah.
And I'm sure that's where he got that idea from. And also the idea about exchanging one human for one Minbari. There's a rule about elves and humans intermixing. Basically, elves and humans, they are genetically compatible. Like there's no biological issues if you want to reproduce with them. But there's an issue of fate because like Iluvatar, the supreme deity, he's assigned a different fate to elves and humans. So if you're an elf, it's your fate to remain in the world until the world is over. Even if you die, you still have to remain there. But whereas humans, when a human dies, you leave the physical universe. So when an elf and a human marries, and if you read the Silmarillion, you'll see this. There's always like some point where they have to decide which fate they want to be assigned to. Like one of the people has to decide, like, do we want to be elf? Do we want to be counted among the elves or counted among the humans? And sometimes the choice is made for them. Sometimes they get to make the choice themselves. So, anyway, I'll come to that. So actually, the immortality of the elves. Um, they don't. I used to think, like one thing that confused me when I read Silmarillion, like at the beginning, there's a guy that gets his hand cut off. His name's Maedhros. And I thought, okay, his hand's going to grow back because he's immortal. But it doesn't grow back. And the way I always saw it is if immortality was a real thing, it would work because your body would just heal all the damage, including damage to your telomeres, which wear down over time. But the that's not actually how the elves are immortal. So they're immortal because they're assigned to remain in the earth, like they can't leave it. And they actually can respawn if they die. So let's see here. So I have some quotes. In letter 131, he says, "The elves are immortal, at least as far as this world goes, and hence are concerned rather with the griefs and burdens of deathlessness in time and change than with death." And got another one here. The Fëar of the elves were destined to dwell in Arda for all the life of Arda, and the death of the flesh did not abrogate that destiny. And that one actually comes from one of the Histories of the Middle-earth books called Morgoth's Ring. There's an essay called The Laws and Customs of the Eldar. And what that essay talks about, like how their immortality actually works, and how about rebirth and fading. So if you're an elf and you die, then you go to a place called the Halls of Mandos. And you're not going to die of old age or disease, but you could die from falling off a cliff or starving to death, something like that, or being killed.
Getting killed by being killed by an orc.
Yeah, being killed by an orc or whatever. So if you go to the Halls of Mandos, like when you die, Mandos will summon you, and you can actually refuse the summons of Mandos and choose not to go. But if you do that, you're just going to be a disembodied spirit in the Middle-earth. And what it says is that in the old days, when Morgoth and Sauron were still there, when the elf would die, they would see all of that stuff and they would run for fear and protection towards Mandos. But after Lord of the Rings, after Sauron is defeated, then a lot of elves in the Middle-earth that die, they just stay there as ghosts. They don't bother to come. But if you go to Mandos, I guess it's kind of like the Catholic idea of purgatory, because you'll be like counseled and corrected, and if you accept the correction, then you get reborn as a baby, and then it takes you 50 years to grow up, and when you grow up physically, then you get all your memories back. But if you're very particularly bad and unrepentant, or if you just don't feel like living anymore, then you can just remain in Mandos until the end of time, basically. So that all is there in Laws and Customs of the Eldar. And let's see here. So yeah, I mentioned mixing with humans already. If you marry like an elf, then she has to either choose a human fate or you have to choose an elf fate. And the same choice will be open to the children. So like Beren and Luthien, it seems like they didn't really get a choice. They both got assigned a human fate. But then there's another couple, Tuor and Idril, where the guy is a human and the woman is an elf. And he actually gets to be assigned an elf fate, so he becomes immortal. I think if it was me, it would be an easy choice. I'd be like, nah, man, make me an elf. Or at least, I think that's a better fate.
Yeah, but then there's the chance of purgatory waiting for you.
It's better than going straight to,
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
But
okay.
yeah, so it's interesting. And then that's the same thing that happens in Lord of the Rings. Elrond, he's got mixed human and elf ancestry, and he chose the fate of an elf a long time ago. But apparently his children, they also have to choose. So he has 2 sons and a daughter. And like Tolkien, he never says what happens to the sons, like other than that their decision was put off for a longer time, even after the events of Lord of the Rings. Mm-hmm. But Arwen, she chooses a human fate, and she dies a little bit after Aragorn dies. And then I guess they both go to heaven, or whatever the version of heaven is, as opposed to going to Mandos and respawning. Like, there's no respawn for her because she chooses the human fate.
Yeah.
And then
it's pretty cool. They don't really explain that in the movies or the books, to be honest.
Yeah, the books. So there's a lot more stuff he wrote that didn't get published until after he was dead. And Christopher Tolkien, he published a lot of that stuff in the Histories of the Middle-earth series, which I think is at least 12 books, maybe 13. I have them all. And a lot of that is, some of that is just, a lot of it is just older versions of the published stories, like Lord of the Rings and Silmarillion. But then there's a lot of content that didn't get in, like Laws and Customs of the Eldar, and different essays that kind of add more information, like how Thranduil's father came and took over the Mirkwood elves, who were Avari, such. But yeah, so some of the stuff, it may not be canon. We just know that it was never finished and never published, but he left a lot of stuff hanging with the intent to get around to it later, and then just never did. So the elf magic, is also kind of explained. And I have a quote here from, let's see, I have some quotes here from letter 131 and 155. So he says, their magic is art delivered from many of its human limitations, more effortless, more quick, more complete. Product and vision and unflawed correspondence. And then he also says, the basic motive for magia, quite apart from any philosophic consideration of how it would work, is immediacy, speed, deduction of labor, and reduction also to a minimum or vanishing point of the gap between the idea or desire or the result or effect. So basically, like I like to draw a little bit. I guess I'm a mediocre artist, but compared with people that can't draw at all, I'm pretty decent. But my problem is, for example, how this works. I have an idea and I want to draw the idea, but I don't have the skill to make it look exactly as good as it does in my head. And I also will take a lot of time. But if I'm an elf, I have an idea, and all I need is the materials, whether I'm going to make a statue or a painting or tapestry, and it will look exactly as I imagine it to look. So, I can imagine, that statue of Augustus Caesar with the fat naked babies at his feet? You know what I'm talking about, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you know how it looks, but if I give you a block of stone, could you do it? No, right?
No. Yeah.
No, but if I gave you 1,000 years, maybe you could do it. Maybe if you could live that long. But like the elf, they just sit and they do it, and they do it in a short amount of time. So that's kind of what he means by their magic is they're not limited by human limitations in the way that we are. And fading. So do you have any idea what fading is?
No, I don't.
They mention it in Lord of the Rings, but they don't really say what it is. Like Galadriel says, "Oh, if I stay here, I'm going to fade." So I mentioned that they're immortal, right?
Mm-hmm.
But even though, and they don't regrow missing body parts. So that's because they're still subject to entropy. And over time, entropy actually does wear down their bodies until they eventually will become invisible and intangible. Yeah, and I have a quote on that. And this comes from Morgoth's Ring. The essay is called Of Death and the Severance of Fëa and Hrondo. So, as ages passed, the dominance of their Fëar ever increased, consuming their bodies, as has been noted. The end of this process is their fading, as men have called it, for the body becomes at last, as it were, a mere memory held by the Fëa, and that end has already been achieved in many regions of Middle-earth, so that the elves are indeed deathless and may not be destroyed or changed. So if you can survive and fade, then you don't have to worry about getting stabbed anymore, because you're intangible. But I wonder if, one thing I'm not sure of is if they become intangible, can they still build and manipulate things physically? And I don't know, but he does say that they can, if they want to, reveal themselves to humans in the later ages. So, and one thing that I haven't seen him address is because Avari aren't allowed to leave. So what I'm wondering is if maybe Avari don't fade, or maybe they fade at a much slower pace than the Eldar do. So it could be because they're not able to escape it. But if the Eldar, if they go back to Valinor, then the fading process is halted. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the reasons why they go there, so they can continue to kind of, enjoy life and not be basically like a ghost that can only watch and not do anything. So let's see. So the Remainers, and what happens after Lord of the Rings. Are there still elves in the world? Yes. So is there any mention of elves in later ages? And the answer is yes. The Elfwine story, which has been written and rewritten a few times, you'll encounter in the histories of Middle-earth, is about an English sailor who actually makes it to Toleracia at the time when Vikings are destroying England. And we talked about this in some of our own videos. England got invaded by Vikings and then by Normans. And they couldn't beat off both of them, so they ended up getting taken over by the Normans ultimately. But that's basically the time when this guy decides to bail on England. And there's an old Anglo-Saxon custom where if you're at a social event, they would ask you to give a song, and people would take turns doing that. So the King of England asks Elfwine to sing a song, and he gives this song about how he's sad and depressed, and he doesn't want to be in England anymore. He wants to go and see the elves. And so the people that are there, they get offended by him, and they say, if England is not good enough, let him go find a better land. He need go no further than Ireland if he longs for elves and uncouth wights. God save him. Or he can go to the heathen, or he can go with the heathen to the land of ice that that they say they have found. So it's kind of interesting because in Ireland they have this legend about these people called the Tuatha De Danann, who are the immortals that supposedly lived there before the Irish people came. And the Irish people, they fought with the Tuatha De Danann. The original Irish people were called the Milesians. And after they defeated the immortals, they divided up the land between them. And I guess the land was supposed to be evenly divided, but it's a human who decides how it's going to be divided. So he assigns the top part of the land, the surface, to the humans, and the underground to the immortals. So they all go underground. And there's actually a leader of the Tuatha De Danann, and his name is Nawada of the Silver Hand. And it's kind of, he gets his hand cut off in a battle, and they replace it with an artificial hand made out of silver. So it kind of reminded me of the Maedhros story, where the guy gets his hand cut off at the beginning of Silmarillion, but he still becomes a great leader of his people. And then finally, I want to talk about some fan speculation, because I saw some stuff in forums, like people are continuously speculating on this stuff and coming up with ideas. And so there's something called the Wild Hunt from Germanic legend. Have you heard of the Wild Hunt before?
Never. Mm-mm.
So this is probably, we could probably do a video devoted to just the Wild Hunt, but it was an old legend in Northern Europe about a great hunt, like this ghostly troop of horses and riders that would ride through the sky, making all sorts of noise. And I believe they were also accompanied by like shadowy hounds, and they'll grab up humans from the ground and carry them with them on the hunt and drop them down someplace else. And this is something that people seriously believed in during the Middle Ages. So, of course, we still have people today that are saying they're abducted by aliens and everything. So I suppose that, some legends keep occurring over and over again. But there were fans suggesting that the Wild Hunt may be like what Tolkien had in mind when he came up with Thranduil and his people, that they would go out of the forest sometimes to hunt, in the plains and such. And he mentions that they're still around in later days, like it's mentioned in The Hobbit, but they're even more wary and unwilling to be around humans. So that's one possibility. And then there's also been some fan speculation that maybe Thranduil was inspired by the legend of King Oberon, who is the king of elves and fairies in medieval literature. And then there's my personal speculation that, Tolkien, he probably knew at least as much about history as we do, probably much more. I would say definitely much more, because he was studying history and languages. And, in China, they also have their legends about immortals. So the last emperor, what am I saying? The first emperor, Yingzhang, the Emperor Qin, as he started getting to be, I guess, about our age, he started thinking about dying, and he actually spent a lot of money sending people to look for the immortals that were supposedly around. And he was hoping that he could get the secret of immortality and therefore avoid his fate. Of course, he died. He spent a lot of money in the process, and then his dynasty was overthrown after he was gone. But I'm sure that Tolkien, he knew, like if I knew that, he probably also knew that. And maybe that's why he set the origin of the origin point of the elves in the Far East. That could be part of the reason that he did it. Maybe those guys are Avari that are kind of lingering there. So there's actually a Chinese series that I watched with my wife a couple of years ago called Ice Fantasy. And they got one of the people that designed the sets and costumes for the Lord of the Rings movie to come and design costumes for their show. It's pretty cool. And I saw some of the images of that, and I was like, yeah, I could kind of see something like this. Some of these guys, there was like a couple characters that actually kind of looked like how I pictured the Avari as looking. I'll stick a picture of that in the slideshow, but at any rate, that's all I got on this. I will do a more detailed kind of video on this for my channel if anybody wants like the deep and incredibly esoteric dive. So
how deep does the rabbit hole go? Pretty deep, yeah.
Does,
sure.
Yeah.
I devote a lot of his time on this stuff, right? I also was reading in the Children of Hurin that he was that story, but also a different story he was working on. He was originally writing in like rhyme, like Old English rhyme, like Beowulf.
Yeah.
And he was working on them for like years, and then just kind of like halfway gave up. So anyway, this guy produced a lot of stuff during his lifetime.
Well, he produced a lot of fragments during his lifetime. He didn't finish a lot of the stuff that he's on.
Yeah, and he never doesn't explain why he would stop, but
he may actually, if you read the Tolkien letters, he makes all sorts of excuses, like, I had to repair my house and my kids, and it's like, it's kind of sad. Actually, I'm kind of the same way. But there's like real life stuff that would happen, like with his job and with his family. And then when he got some free time, he'd be like, I just don't feel like working on this anymore. Now I want to go work on that. And so a lot of the stuff just never got finished.
He was also a professor, right? So
right. And he was friends with C.S. Lewis. So when he was close with C.S. Lewis, then that actually helped him, because C.S. Lewis would push him to finish his work, and that's how he was able to finish Lord of the Rings. But eventually they kind of had a falling out, the two of them. And once C.S. Lewis was out of the picture, he was not able to focus as well. He got more close with his oldest son, Christopher. And of course, Christopher, he released a lot of this stuff. And some of those fragments that you're talking about, like the poetry, some of that is actually in the histories of Middle-earth, like the modern English versions. Not a little bit of the Old English is there too, but yeah.
There's a lot more in-depth stuff on your channel, so you should put a link in the description again, although our channel is linked to it anyway, but maybe just put it for the video as well, so people can go check that out, see your channel, Ivor. And maybe one thing as a closing, could you tell me how Morgoth was killed, or taken out of the picture by the Valar? Do you remember? Or because
that's in the Silmarillion. Okay, so what happens is the Valar, they finally decide they actually take him out twice. The first time they take him out is after the elves appear, and they take him and they put him in prison in Valinor for a while, and then they decide, okay, he's reformed, and they let him out, which obviously was a mistake. And then he goads, like he steals the Silmarils, and he goads Fëanor to go back to Middle Earth, and he destroys the two trees. And after he destroys the two trees, he puts a lot of his power into the physical world, and he loses his ability to change shape. He becomes bound permanently to a physical body. And the second time the Valar take him out, they come with a big army, and a lot of their army is actually made up of another tribe of elves called oh my goodness, called the Vanyar. And the Vanyar had no interest to ever go back to Middle Earth, but they come back just to help take down Morgoth. And they actually cut his feet off, and because he no longer has the ability to change forms, he just has no feet. And they try him, and he makes some excuses, and they don't care, and then they throw him outside of the Middle Earth, which may be actually outside of the physical universe. But it's said that in the last days he'll come back in, and there'll be like a final battle with him. So then,
because I mean, if you're just like a Lord of the Rings newbie like myself, then you're just like, oh, you have this guy Sauron, but there was somebody before him. You don't really find out too much about it just by reading the books, or at least not by watching the movies. So
yeah, and the movies, they did take, even though they say they tried to be as faithful as they could, they actually made some very bad mistakes. Like I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'll give one example, like where they make Sauron a disembodied eye. In the books, it says very clearly, that after his finger is cut off by Isildur, it never grows back. So he has 4 fingers on one hand. And in one of the letters, Tolkien was asked, like, how come in your world there's no mention of religion, there's no religious heraldry or symbolism or evocations of deity or anything like that? And what he says is it's an ancient time before there was an organized religion, and evil is still physically incarnate. So it's not like spirits. They all have physical bodies. Like all the demons, they have physical bodies, and they're visible in the world. And so when the elves and humans go and they fight with Sauron and the Balrog and Morgoth, they're actually acting out a spiritual warfare, like today we would pray, and in that world, they're physically doing something about it. So like the physical is the spiritual. So and the big change at the end of Lord of the Rings that's significant is that evil is no longer physically incarnate in the world, and that's what shifts the world from the Third Age to the Fourth Age. So they totally botched by making Sauron
just an eye or just a spirit kind of thing.
Yeah. They totally botched that, and he actually loses his ability to physically incarnate after the ring is destroyed. Like that's why he doesn't want that ring destroyed, because he's going to become a spirit that can only influence things in the spiritual realm, and he won't be able to physically do anything anymore after that ring is ruined. So
wow, never even realized that. Well,
maybe for the next if we do another one of these, maybe I can do a video about all the mistakes they made in the movies and why. People might be interested in that. So
cool. Well, thanks, Ivor. Appreciate it. Thought it was a cool story. Maybe a different kind of history, fictional history, but still history. Yeah. And it's tied to some history because, like Tolkien was inspired by the Greek and the Norse gods and all that stuff. So if you're talking about physical forms, it's kind of like the way the Greeks, I guess, would have seen it mostly as well. But I mean, good story, and appreciate it. And like, share, subscribe, check out Ivor's channel, which is linked below for more similar content. And with that, unless you have anything else to say, I think we should close it off and see you in the next one.
Leave us a like, comment, feedback. Did you like this? Did you not? Etc. That's all I got.